Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people working... I forgot to breathe before I started recording. Sorry.
Monotype.
All right, here we go. Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people working at the intersection of type and everyday life. I'm your host, Doug Wilson, and today I'm here with Livia Haltari, the social media manager at Monotype.
Hi, Doug. Nice to be talking with you. I'm super excited for the episode you have in store for us today.
Yeah, thanks so much. We'll be speaking today with Yuen-Rapati, who is a type designer specifically for watches, which really combines two of my loves, typography and mechanical watches.
Yeah, that seems like a really niche overlap for this conversation today. Just wondering, how did you come to meet Lee?
So I learned about Lee actually when I purchased a watch from the Fears Watch Company and learned that he was the designer of the numerals on this specific watch. I fell in love with watches a few years ago when a friend of mine got into watches, and ever since I've just fallen down the rabbit hole of mechanical watches. There's so much history, there's so much nuance, and anyone that is designing type specifically for watches, I definitely had to meet and interview.
What is it about mechanical watches that you love?
Ooh, that's such a good question. Mechanical watches, I know it seems a bit cliche as a white man in his 40s getting into watches, but there's so much about watches that is like this beautiful mix of like mechanics and also like aesthetics. And honestly, I see a lot of overlap between that and typography where there are these restraints. You know, a watch has to be readable, and the same with the typeface. It has to be readable most of the time, but within those constraints and within those, there's just unlimited possibility of aesthetic things. And that really is what draws me to both watches and type.
Yeah, seems like, a super interesting overlap of two interests of yours. And it seems like a function of typography that you might not think about all the time, but something that is so apparent in everyone's life and also just history too, it seems.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there is so much history in the world of watches and timepieces, as well as so much history in typography. And so that's what this interview is all about with Lee, is talking about both typography and watches and how those two kind of become a Venn diagram of things that both him and I love.
I love it. Let's kick it over to you and Lee to talk about watches and type.
I'm happy to have Lee Yuen-Rapati today on the podcast. And he, like myself, is a passionate lover of both typography and watches. Thanks for joining us, Lee.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Doug.
So as an interview about watches, I got to ask first, let's do a wrist check. What watch are you wearing right now?
So I'm wearing a very rare Fears watch, which was a Friends and Family edition we did at the end of last year. This is a simple quartz watch. We did it to mark the 200th anniversary of the birth of Edwin Fear, who founded the company. And mine has lots of fun typography on it for the hour numerals. So that's kind of one of my go-to watches.
That's great. Well, in your honor, I am wearing also a Fears watch, the archival 1930 watch. And how I visually describe it is it's actually kind of a tall rectangular watch. It's kind of in the style of the Cartier tank, which I've always liked that style of the Cartier tank, but both financially I couldn't afford it, and I wanted something a little bit different. So this watch is kind of, I would say it's an Art Deco watch, a 1930s kind of feel. It's tall and rectangular. It's got a very simple dial with very simple numerals that I know that you did design. And something that I love about the hands of the watch are that the steel is blued. So it's this beautiful blue hands that you can only see in some light. Often it just looks black on this like creamy, slightly goldish, slightly white dial, and these just bold black numerals are something that I really, really think is beautiful. And that's why I purchased this watch. And in fact, it was engraved, I know, for 1 year of each year that the Fears company was in business. And I got 1913 because both of my grandfathers were born in 1913. And so I requested that specific number and I got that.
Oh, that's amazing. We had some people who wanted a specific year, and so I love that you were one of the happy wearers who got a year that's significant to yourself and allows you to have a special relationship with the watch.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then so tell me about the numerals on the Friends and Family edition.
So for the friends and family, every hour numeral is from a different style or a different typeface. And some of them are current Fierce watches, but others go back into the back catalog. So I was looking through a lot of our archival documentation, finding stuff from the late 1800s, quite a bit in the early 20th century, some in the mid 20th century. Yeah, there is one numeral on there, which is actually making its debut. It's going to make its official debut on another upcoming watch, but I thought it would be fun to cheekily stick it in this one.
Yeah, that's super exciting. So was it difficult to balance all of those different numerals and still make it feel not too wild and crazy?
Yeah, it was a challenge because it's a mix of Western Arabic numerals and a few Roman numerals, and then a mixture of styles as well. So there are sans serif, there are very curly numerals, there are Art Deco numerals. So I thought about trying to initially lay them out in terms of when the watches had come out, the originals, and it didn't make the most compelling layout for the watch. So I decided to just throw that out, balance it visually, and the final step was to actually add some fun colors to the hour numerals. And we were internally calling it the party dial.
That's awesome. I think that's great. And so it was just given to very close friends and family and people who work and have worked with Fierce then.
Yeah. So it's a pretty exclusive group of wrists.
Well, while we're talking about Fierce, tell me a little bit about Fierce. I know you work for them, but tell me a bit about the company and what you do for them.
So the company itself was founded in 1846 in Bristol, England, by Edwin Fear. And it continued in the Fear family up until the 1970s, at which point it went dormant. What would have been the incoming managing director decided that he wanted to do other things. In other parts of the industry, a lot of brands kind of closed due to the economic crunch from quartz watches or battery watches. So it lay dormant until 2016 when it was refounded by the great grandson. I think I have enough greats in there of Edwin, and this is a gentleman named.
That's really special.
Yeah, a gentleman named Nicholas, and he at the time was working for Rolex and wanted to pursue a more entrepreneurial career. And so I think it was his mom said, "Oh, why don't you restart the family watch business?" And he didn't realize that it was actually the Fears watch company.
Oh wow! Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, so it like this amazing brand kind of was always there, and it just fell into his lap, and he then pursued that. And so 2016 was when the brand was restarted, and at that point it was just him, a few close suppliers and that kind of thing. It was the solo show.
That's so exciting. And so he was into watches and didn't realize that it was actually in his past history then.
Yeah, I heard that he knew that there were watchmakers in his family, but he didn't realize that it was the Fear brand, because I guess that surname passed to another part of the family.
Oh, I see.
His name, Bowman Scargill, not Fear. That it was all a lot of interesting discoveries for him to find out.
So now Fears manufactures original watches, or are they remakes of watches? What does Fears make today?
So that's actually another interesting side of the company, because it's been very much in vogue in the last 5 years to remake vintage watches, especially those from the middle of the 20th century. What the strategy for Fears is that the bulk of what we're going to produce today, we would like to think of it as if Fears had never stopped producing watches, what would they naturally produce today? So they all have inspiration or lineage to our back catalog, but most of them are not one-to-one creations. We still do that, which is the watch that you're wearing, but we want to focus on looking forward.
I have to say, every watch that I see that comes from Fears is both beautiful and does seem to have that nice balance of heritage, but also modern feeling. And this is not a Fears promotional podcast, but I think it's a really interesting story and a really interesting brand, kind of a micro brand, right? I mean, I imagine not even trying to compete with the giants of Omega and Rolex, correct?
Well, we are and we aren't. We do like to try and punch above our weight. And in the explosion of micro brands since the mid 2010s, I mean, that was definitely a great environment that the brand got started in. But we've been established now for enough time that internally we don't really see ourselves as a micro brand. We're still a small team and small numbers of watches being produced, but we try and view the watches just of themselves. So if we come out with a watch that, say, stacks up spec wise to like an Omega, then that's how we see it.
That makes sense. Well, Lee, tell me a bit about yourself. How do you introduce yourself to others?
I wear quite a few different hats, so it definitely depends on who's on the other side of that conversation. In general, I would call myself a designer, but my focus now is entirely within the watch industry. So that might be I illustrate watches, that might be I make typefaces for watches, that might also be doing 3D work or general design styling work.
How did you yourself get into watches?
That was actually through my mom. So a lot of people in the watch world or who are interested in watches get into it through one of their parents, sometimes passing down a watch. In this case, I was in the middle of my undergraduate studies, just doing interdisciplinary design. And my mom happened to see this photo of a very high-end Swiss watch from a brand called Urwerk. And said, you have to see this. You just have to, I'm not going to say anything about it. You just have to see it. So I go look it up and it blows my mind. Urwerk are a very sci-fi, extremely high-end brand. Their watches often don't have hands. They're not circular. So they'll have a spinning cube with the hours printed on the cube, and that will rotate around the section of a watch, and that will then display what minute it is. Even though they use very sometimes traditional inspirations for some of how they display time, all of the styling, the aesthetics is very sci-fi. And so that is also a topic I love, and they really appealed to me. And it was a very quick rabbit hole to fall down, and one I haven't one I haven't emerged from.
So tell me about how you got into specifically the typography of watches. That seems extremely niche.
Yes. So outside of my interest in watches, as I was finishing up my undergrad, I was also introduced to type design. So we had a few typographic classes, but nothing focusing on the actual design of letter forms. And I happened to take a workshop in just getting introduced into type design. And it was a form of design that really appealed to me outside of everything else, just in terms of how you have to think systematically about everything. There's also a rich history in it. So I initially was just getting interested in type design. The other half of my interests lay in watches. And so it was only a matter of time before the two came together. And then I really started to discover, there is actually specific typographic styles for timepieces. And that's been then another large focus of my life and creative and professional pursuits.
So let's go into that a little bit because, yeah, I know there is a tradition and a history of certain types of numerals and markings for watches. So talk me through a little bit of that history and tell me more about that.
So what you see on a lot of mechanical timepieces, I'm going to skip like all of the sundials and monumental kind of, we're not going to talk about Stonehenge. But what you see coming mainly out of Europe from the Middle Ages are mechanical timekeepers. And once they start to get miniaturized so that they're no longer on the side of a church in one part of a town or a city, you start to see a lot of trends emerge. That's actually very specifically what I'm interested in because it's very hard to pinpoint the first example of one style. So I look more at the trends. And what you see are for hour numerals, Roman numerals are used. And then when minutes get introduced, because the first clocks didn't have a minute hand, there was no need to be timing to that accuracy in a day. You start to see Western Arabic numerals getting used. And In general, they would follow the predominant printed typographic styles of the era. So you see a lot of, I would describe as spindly numeral forms, a few like ball terminals, that kind of thing. But because timekeeping or horology, which is the study, the practice, the making of timekeeping, is so entrenched in guildcraft tradition, there are very few instances of strange outliers that go completely against the norm. And so, in general, what you'll see are hour numerals that are radially arrayed around a round surface or dial or face. And then the minute numerals started on the inside because the minute hand actually used to be shorter than the hour hand, but then they moved to the outside, and that's kind of stuck since.
So then when was that change, or was there a specific change from Roman numerals to what you call the Arabic numbers? And why are they called Arabic or Western numbers, actually? I've always wondered that.
So, yeah, I can't say here why they are called Arabic. I mean, there's a large history and blending of different scripts that make what we consider as Westerners Arabic numerals. And I try to distinguish, especially when speaking to a more typographic audience, I try to say Western Arabic because there are sets of Eastern Arabic and very strange styles of what you could describe as Arabic script numerals that appear on timepieces. But for the most part, you start to see Western Arabic numerals in the 18th century, predominantly from a brand or a house called Breguet. You could describe them as italicized, so they are slanted, but they were initially a set of hand-painted numerals that have really stuck around since the 18th century.
Right. So I've heard that term, the Breguet numerals. They are their own specific style, correct?
Yes. So it remains to be seen if they actually did come from the manufacturer Breguet. I've heard it said that Abraham Louis Breguet, who's the maker behind the brand, definitely did not design the numerals. But in any case, we can see a very consistent use of this style from his house. And what you'll find are, in general, bold numeral forms. For instance, the 2 will have a massive curl in its upper bowl, and you generally don't see ball terminals. The strokes will just terminate in a wisp.
Got it. So if there's all these different styles of numerals, do you have one that you really like to design, or one that is more challenging than another to design?
I actually find Roman numerals quite challenging, not necessarily from a creative standpoint. There's really only so much you can do with thin and thick lines. But what I find, especially now designing in the digital world, is in order to design in my opinion, like a well-balanced set of Roman numerals, you have to not think about a flat baseline. You have to think about a curved baseline. You have to think about balancing very wide numerals like the 8, which is VIII. And the 4 on watches is normally written with 4 I's rather than an IV. So those wide characters need to be balanced with the 1, the X for the 10, that kind of thing. And what you'll find on watches that the attention has not been paid is usually they'll choose a capital X just from a font. And the kind of tell is if you balance the widths of the 9 and the 3 on old antiquarian watches or clocks, those 2 characters being on, the far left and right of the dial or the face, they should balance each other out in terms of their width. And what you'll find with modern fonts being used is usually the X is quite a wide character. And so the 9 is going to be way wider than 3 capital I's. And that's something that when I'm designing a set, those have to be balanced. I kind of throw at the rulebook that I know for designing capital letters for print. And it's a surprisingly labor-intensive process to design a set of Roman numerals.
What you're saying is that you have to specifically design each of those characters separate from what would normally be designed for a typeface.
Yeah, exactly. And when I'm designing numerals for watches, I'm not thinking 0 to 9, I'm thinking 1 to 12, because your 12 may use a more narrow 2. You may have to use different sizes of 1 because there are 5 different ones that can appear on just an hour set. So it's all of these little things that used to be kind of made inherently when everything was being done by hand or on a pantograph to get it scaled properly. But then when you start to see digital fonts, pre-made print fonts being used, some of that knowledge is unfortunately was lost.
So tell me a little bit more about that curved baseline, because I can imagine that's actually really, really tough, because a baseline in normal typography is, that's sacrosanct, right? Like that's what literally everything sits on.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not really a problem for narrow characters like your 1, 2, even 3. You wouldn't necessarily put those on watches or timepieces and notice if they had a flat parallel baseline and cap height. But with the wide ones, because they are curving around more of this round dial, you need to take that into account. So when I'm designing, it's usually a multi-program kind of affair where I'll start the layout in something like Illustrator, then I'll go over to dedicated font software, put in some coordinates and some templates for the baseline and cap height, and then I have to design everything from that glyph space. And again, it's always 1 to 12, not 0 to 9. So there are always these kind of considerations that pop up.
Got it. So then do you just have a lot of fonts that you've designed that are just numerals? Do you ever extend out to like a full Latin character set or anything like that?
No, the bulk of what I do is just numeral sets. What you find on a lot of timepieces is that they only use the uppercase. And even then, the amount of text on a watch is not that much. It's the brand logo. Usually there's the kind of country of origin, so Swiss made. And then everything else from there are kind of 1 or 2 word, what kind of mechanism is in the watch. And in general, that kind of those styles are already set when I'm coming to a project.
So then do you ever get to design a face completely from scratch, or are some of those things already dictated, like the style that will say, Swiss made or automatic, or the logo type or the signature, as you said?
Sometimes they'll be dictated. What I tend to focus on is a style that would be consistent with what we saw in the middle of the 20th century. Between, I would say, like the 30s to the 70s, 1930s to the 1970s, you start to see a very consistent style of letter form being used. And it's a lot of people would describe it as like a sans serif. I call it monolinear because there are generally slight flares to the stroke endings. So it's not your most traditional sans serif style. But that was used all across the industry in different sizes, in different widths, but a visually consistent weight. And then when computers came along, that all got replaced with Helvetica and Arial, all manner of, I would say, watch typographic sins. But when I'm doing letter forms for a watch, generally I'm trying to stick to something that would have felt more true to form in the 1960s.
When a company comes to you, because you are a freelance designer, so a company can come to you and just hire you specifically for your numerals, do you have to have a lot of back and forth between those clients, or do they come with a very strict idea and you're just kind of the practitioner that's fleshing out that idea?
Generally, I require them to give me a very detailed brief. Luckily for myself, most watches are quite consistent in the general style. So it's nothing where you're really having to dig deep into some very weird style. Most brands, most projects will follow. We want something that feels 18th century or mid-century modern. And then for me, it's all about what is the actual timepiece going to be. If this is going to be a watch with lots of details on the dial, then I need to do something that doesn't have a lot of details in the letter form. And that's kind of how the projects will go.
Got it. So you talked about like starting off in Illustrator and then going into a font software and then maybe kind of back and forth. There's so many ways to apply numerals or to engrave numerals or to put, there's all these different ways of getting the numbers on the dial. And all of those are 3D in some form or fashion, whether it's printed by screen or whether it's engraved. So how do you work with two-dimensional on a computer and then visualize that for 3D?
So that's where my kind of previous interest in industrial design really comes to help. I'm starting in one 2D software, then I'm going to dedicated type software, and then I'm actually going into dedicated 3D software. I mean, much like designing a typeface requires a lot of detail that nobody's going to see, and very small changes can make a big difference in a full typeface. The same can be applied to a timepiece. So when I'm placing numerals on a dial, I need absolute coordinates, and that is most easily found in CAD, like 3D software. So I'm usually jumping in between 3 different sets of software to fully design a dial for a watch.
So I have to imagine that you see a parallel between watches and typography because it's so much about the tiny details. Even in a simple mechanical watch, the tiniest of details make such a massive difference. What parallels do you see between watches and typography? Because I think there's a connection there.
Yeah, so it's definitely about tiny details. You're designing a system, various things have to work in that system, various parts of that system have to work for each other, and you can add artistry to it. The other element that really appeals to me in both of these kind of fields is the strong sense of tradition. Now, there are definitely a lot of typefaces and watches that are non-traditional, but for the most part, both of these industries have huge segments of them that not necessarily cling to tradition, but are very highly influenced by tradition. And for me, that's something that actually really appeals to me. I've never been much for being a rebel. So being able to play in those fields where it's not necessarily always about disrupting what is already there. It's staying true to certain things, doing things to a very high degree. Those two elements definitely appeal to me equally in both type design and watch design.
That makes sense. So you don't feel overly constrained or overly burdened by that tradition?
Not yet. I mean, I think there will come a day where I start to feel like, oh, we need to see some avant-garde numeral forms on watches. But even then, there are so many interesting examples from, especially once you get into a modernist time period in the 20th century, you do see an explosion of different styles in watches. So there's both a lot of traditional ground that hasn't been covered yet, and there are always people who are doing inspiring work that doesn't conform to any of those traditions. So yeah, I haven't reached that pigeonhole yet. I hope I never do.
Tell me a bit about 1 Hour Watch. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so that was a way of keeping a few things working for me as well as it was a learning project. So it started in late 2014. This was about the time that I was finishing up my undergrad in interdisciplinary design. And I was realizing, well, I'm going to go out into the world. Ideally, I'll get a job, but that might not satisfy all of my creative needs. When I was a child, I was drawing everywhere on everything. And until I went to university, always getting in trouble for filling the margins of my notebooks with drawings. And when I was doing my undergrad, I took a technical drawing course that I really, really enjoyed. So the 1 Hour Watch project was a way for me to carry forward and continue to practice the technical skills that I had learned, and was a perfect avenue for learning about watches, which was the interest that I was beginning to feel. And the broad strokes for the project was I was going to spend up to an hour every day drawing an original watch. And it was always by hand. There is, I think, 1, maybe 2 digital drawings there, but that's it. And it basically had to be done within 60 minutes because I realized I could very easily spend the entire day drawing a watch. So an hour was a good amount of time to think of a concept, and it kept me in practice. And it really did take on a life of its own where after the first 100 days of drawing, I thought, this seems to be going well. I'm having fun with this. And then it was a few hundred days and then a couple years. And I think it was probably within the first year of starting to draw these watches, a friend actually said, well, you should post these on Instagram. I was posting them on a Twitter account, which, nobody followed and I didn't ask anyone to follow, but, that was the extent of it. And a friend said, there's a big watch community on Instagram and you should just post stuff on there.
Right. It's made for photos and images.
Exactly. I was hesitant, but I got into it. And then it turned out, there's this absolutely wonderful community of people on Instagram. And that really was the point at which I began to see the project take on another phase, connecting to a much larger audience and allowing me to get these connections both with collectors, enthusiasts, but also eventually brands. At this point, I was still living in Canada and very far away from any part of the watch world. But after a few years of doing it consistently every day, when I finally did get to a more metropolitan area in London, where there are watch fairs, I got to meet some of these people who I'd conversed with online or had seen my work. And you'd say, oh, yeah, hi, I'm Lee. And they go, oh, that's great. And then it's like, oh, yeah, I do 1 hour watch. And then the conversation would balloon to something else. So it was a wonderful project. It went on for almost 3,000 consecutive days.
Wow.
Yeah.
that is impressive.
When I started out, I had this kind of joking goal of like, well, if I make it in the watch industry, maybe I'll stop. I didn't necessarily think that would happen. I thought it would be nice, but the reality was when I decided to stop posting and drawing watches every day, I'd been working in the industry as my main source of income for over a year. And so I thought, this is not just a fluke. I'm here to stay. So maybe I don't have to concentrate on ending every single one of my days with trying to draw a watch.
So it sounds like with that project, you're interested in more than just the numerals. You're interested in more than just the type on a watch. You're interested in the entire watch itself.
Absolutely. I still know far too little about how watches mechanically work. You're never going to learn everything about watches. But yeah, for me, it was the style, then the history crept into it, the craft crept more into it, and then definitely the typography crept into it. And the typography was what I ended up kind of adding as the main focal point of my focus at one point. But then it was always to go back and think about, I want to design watches as a whole. I now know how important typography is to watches. And so that's definitely been and remains kind of like a large focus. But it was always like, if you can design a whole watch from the ground up, that's my dream.
That sounds like an awesome and very challenging dream to have.
Oh yeah, it's a never-ending challenge.
What is your favorite part of designing for a watch?
That's a difficult question. I definitely enjoy the concept stage the most before it becomes too repetitive. This is, for me, when you can also just be sketching forms. And in general, I'm not necessarily thinking about typography at this point. So this is going into a bit more of the industrial design side of it. Getting that project started, I found, is the most interesting part. Getting it finished is always good, but that's more of a necessity than something I'm looking forward to.
Often, the elephant in the room when we're talking about watches is like, wait, why do I need a watch? And why especially do I need a mechanical watch? I have an iPhone, I have my computer, my car has a clock in it. What's your answer to that?
It's one that doesn't make logical sense. But the biggest thing for me actually in saying why somebody should wear a watch is convenience. It's often easier to just look at your wrist than pull a phone out of a pocket. I mean, there's a reason why we went from pocket watches to wristwatches. But frankly, the other main driving force, which is maybe a bit surface level, is it can be a fun accessory. The other elephant in the room, at least when you're talking about watches, is it's a very male-dominated arena. And what you find is a large part of the audience does not really get to flex style in the same way as the rest of the population. If you're able to find something that you enjoy and can afford, then it's a very good way to add a little bit of flair, a little bit of style. Once that point has been crossed, then I get to the actual interesting kind of why you should wear watches. You should wear it because of the history, because it's fun to look at how this piece of metal that's on your wrist, or plastic in some cases, how it works.
Yeah, I would agree. There's multiple layers of it. And I think that is what's fun about the watch industry. Especially what's great is there's entry levels into watches wherever you want to start. If you desperately want a Rolex and only want a Rolex, at some point, maybe you can save up and get a Rolex. But there's so much more than Rolex, right?
Yeah, exactly. And even if you want a watch that is really your own, I mean, at this point, there are so many micro brands and even larger established brands like Swatch have customizers where you can really make a watch your own. You can make it part of your personality. And that's also a lot of fun.
So tell me about a dream watch, not on the mechanical side of it, but what would be a dream watch? And explain to me the typography that would be on that watch.
There are a couple different answers I can give to this. There are watches from the past that have a lot of typography on them. The one which probably has the most typography or letter forms is a world timer watch. And this is a watch that displays, in general, 24 different cities to represent 24 time zones. And it does it in generally like a sub 36 millimeter diameter on your wrist. So these are absolutely tiny letter forms. And if you want to get an example of how type has been handled on watches, there's probably not a better example. Unfortunately, they are very rare and ludicrously expensive for the most part.
Yeah. Is it the challenge of trying to get all of those letter forms and city names? Is that what interests you?
Yeah. And there are different ways that they've been displayed. And then it's also interesting seeing, because it is still very much a handmade object, even though we're using pantographs and automatic engravers and that kind of thing. You see how the letter forms have been treated. The one that I think most people will point to is like the flat top A. So a lot of capital A's on watches, rather than coming to an apex at the top, they come to a flat horizontal line, which helps to add more space into the interior of the character, making it more readable. And so you start to see lots of little things like these. And sometimes they differ a little bit from one letter to another. And that's down to the handmade nature of it. So that's one answer. The other one another example is some of the old pocket watches that you can find from the 18th, 19th centuries. There is such an interesting array of typography that you can find, even though if you look at them on the face, it's just going to be a set of 12 Roman numerals, sometimes with a set of Arabic numerals around it. The maker's mark, even where the watch is made. Some of these watches have secret signatures that they're done by hand. And it's engrossing if you're able to see them through a microscope or macro photography.
Obviously, you and I are both deep down the rabbit hole of both typography and watches. But for someone that's just getting into watches, what's a good entry point for someone that's, curious about watches but doesn't even know where to start?
I would probably start looking up watch blogs, and the big one is Hodinkee, but there are a ton of other interesting watch blogs that exist now. And for me, because it is watches for the most part, or at least the watches that I work with or am more interested in, are luxury products. There's kind of no other way to put it. They're very, very, very expensive. And even for myself, while I love to own a plethora of different watches, there's no justifiable way to actually own all of them. So I generally say, don't think about how much the watch is going to cost. Find out what you're interested in, and then determine if, how necessary it is to own that thing, or if you can find something that maybe is a little bit more affordable. There's certainly a lot of watches out now that you get a lot of bang for your buck in terms of an entry level piece. But I generally try and keep the money separate. I'm interested in watches from a tradition or a creative kind of standpoint.
Absolutely. So I always ask this at the end of any interview. What questions have I not asked that you wanted to talk about?
Usually somebody will ask about what's the worst fonts that you've seen on a dial.
Oh, yeah, let's
like,
do it.
Who are the bad boys?
Yeah. So you mentioned world timers, of course, and I think world timers absolutely are where some of the best and worst typography I've ever seen on watches. And one that we've talked about is a Patek Philippe watch that is just mechanically absolutely amazing. And I have seen it with both artificially condensed Arial and artificially condensed, I don't even know what it was, kind of Times New Romanish something. Like, what happened?
Yeah, I think there's one that has, and I don't remember the reference number for the watch, but it's got full capital city names all in swash caps.
Yes, and right. Yes, that's the one.
It's like, how did this happen? Because you know, 40, 50 years ahead of this watch produced some of the most beautiful examples of it. To go back in the 1970s, a lot of the European watch industry was disrupted by battery watches finally becoming more affordable than mechanical watches. And that led to this whole industry being decimated. And what you find from before that time is you'll have dedicated dial makers, and they'll be making dials, the faces of watches, for multitude of different brands. And so that's where the expertise lies. But when those brands stop ordering that parts, those factories close, those people retire, and the watch industry got reinvigorated in the late 90s and then into the 2000s. And by that time, you had computers come in, desktop publishing come in, and a lot of what the typography was for watches before the 70s wasn't necessarily to make beautiful typography. We kind of regard it as beautiful typography now because it's got this tradition. It's been used so much that we've become accustomed to it. And then suddenly that's taken away. And what's necessary for type to do on a watch? It's to be legible. And frankly, it pains me to say, but your default desktop fonts are legible because on watches, the printing methods are so accurate that they can print stuff at 2 point and you can read it, even if it's not letter spaced properly, even if it's, you know, not necessarily the best weight of typeface. So you just find people really going back to, well, I defaulted to using my dial maker back in the 60s. I'm going to default to using the default font on my computer now. And that brings forward this whole kind of regression of style. It's only been really the last 5-6 years where a lot of brands are starting to bring custom typography back. And so to go back to this example of these world timer watches with tons of letters on the dial, and in some cases they're squishing Times New Roman or they're using only swash caps. It's examples of people who've kind of lost their way and are really only looking at, well, I can read it, or I can read it and it looks fancy. And it's wild to think that a watch that's $100,000 is going to have Times New Roman or Arial.
Right.
It pains me to see these things. And then when I was studying it, I went back and was like, well, is there inherently anything wrong about it? You can still read it. And it's like, okay, so there's nothing inherently wrong with using a default desktop font to display typography on a watch. Where I think that the big issue comes in is that it completely goes against the ethos of that product. Like, that product it's exclusive, luxury. It has all of these ties to tradition, of which many things were bespoke made for it.
Yeah. So that's interesting. You're talking about that specialized skill that kind of went away in the 60s and 70s. And that totally makes sense. So do you see yourself as trying to reconnect back to that expertise and hopefully you and others like you bringing that forward into the watch industry now?
Absolutely. So I've been looking deep into watch typography since, I would say, 2015, nearly 10 years at this point. And what I've found is that there are increasing amounts of graphic designers, type designers who are recognizing that this is an important thing and that this can be a fun thing. And then the other side of it is there have always been type designers working in the watch industry. And typography in watches has definitely become much more apparent now. And that's allowing more people to get into it, more people and more people to appreciate it.
Well, Lee, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise and kind of your story of how you got into it. And I'm thrilled to see what you create next.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, this has been a very quick hour.
Absolutely. If you want to see more of Lee's work, check out his website at watchtype.net, and make sure also to go to his Instagram account, 1 Hour Watch, where you can see his amazing original watch drawings that he drew in an hour or less. Creative Characters is brought to you by Monotype. It's produced by the wonderful Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan, and we'll be back with more episodes soon.